The medic bent over the motionless body, checking for vital signs one last time. Nothing. The young soldier lay among the carnage, his uniform soaked in blood, his rifle arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Another casualty of the brutal mountain warfare that had claimed so many lives that week. The medic shook his head, marked the body, and moved on to those who could still be saved. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because the Gurkha wasn't dead. Not even close. What happened in the next several hours would become one of the most extraordinary acts of courage documented in military history. This is the true account of how a single soldier, left for dead on a frozen mountainside, woke up surrounded by enemy forces and continued fighting despite wounds that should have killed him 3 times over. No reinforcements. No backup. No hope. Just one man, his weapons, and a warrior spirit that refused to die. The year was 1945, and World War II was entering its final, desperate phase. While most Americans remember the war ending with victory in Europe and the atomic bombs in Japan, there was another theater of war that continued to rage with savage intensity, the mountains of Burma, where British and Commonwealth forces were locked in a brutal campaign against the Japanese Empire. And it was here, in some of the most unforgiving terrain on earth, that the Gurkhas earned their fearsome reputation. For those unfamiliar, the Gurkhas are soldiers from Nepal, recruited into the British and Indian armies for over 200 years. Their motto says it all: better to die than be a coward. These aren't just words painted on a recruiting poster. For a Gurkha, this is a sacred oath, a binding contract with honor itself. They carry the kukri, a curved knife that's part tool, part weapon, and entirely legendary. A symbolic tradition often associated with Gurkha culture suggests that once drawn, the blade must serve its purpose, reflecting the seriousness with which these warriors approach combat. Our story centers on Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung, though the men in his unit simply called him Lochi. At just 4 feet 11 inches tall and weighing barely 110 pounds, he didn't look like anyone's idea of a superhero. He had a quiet demeanor, a quick smile, and the kind of humble bearing that made him blend into any crowd. But those who served alongside him knew better. They'd seen the fire that burned behind those calm eyes. They'd witnessed the transformation that came over him in combat, when this soft-spoken young man became something formidable and unstoppable. Lochi had enlisted at 17, lying about his age like so many young men desperate to serve. He'd grown up in the hills of Nepal, in a village so remote that the modern world was just a rumor. His childhood had been one of extreme poverty, where meals were never guaranteed and winters could kill the weak. But it had also been a childhood that forged him into something steel-hard, teaching him to endure suffering that would break lesser men. The mountains had been his first teacher, and they'd taught him well: never quit, never surrender, never show weakness to your enemies. By 1945, Lochi was a veteran. He'd seen combat across Burma, fighting in conditions that would make modern soldiers weep. Jungle warfare where you couldn't see your enemy until his bayonet was at your throat. Monsoon rains that turned foxholes into graves. Diseases that killed more men than bullets. Leeches, malaria, dysentery, and an enemy who fought with fanatical determination, who would rather die than surrender. The Japanese respected few opponents, but they'd learned to fear the Gurkhas. Stories circulated among Japanese troops about these small, silent men who attacked with knives in the darkness, who never retreated, who seemed immune to pain and fear. On the night of May 12, 1945, Lochi's unit was dug in at a position near Tongdor, in Burma's Arakan region. They were part of the 8th Gurkha Rifles, holding a strategic point that the Japanese desperately wanted to recapture. Intelligence suggested an attack was coming, but intelligence in that theater was always sketchy at best. You never really knew when or where the enemy would hit, only that they would hit hard and without mercy. Lochi was positioned in a forward trench, part of a three-man position overlooking the likely approach routes. With him were two other Gurkhas, brothers from his village. They'd shared stories and cigarettes, these three, during the long hours of darkness when waiting was the hardest part. They talked about home, about the mountains they'd left behind, about the families they'd see again when this nightmare finally ended. They didn't talk about death. Gurkhas never did. Death was always present, a fourth companion in every foxhole, but acknowledging it was considered bad luck. The attack began just after midnight. No warning, no preparatory bombardment, just sudden, overwhelming violence erupting from the darkness. The Japanese had massed a force estimated at over 200 men for this assault, determined to break through the Gurkha defensive line and recapture the strategic ground. They came in waves, screaming their battle cries, firing as they charged, absolutely certain that the defensive positions would be quickly overrun. They hadn't counted on the Gurkhas. Lachhi and his companions opened fire immediately, their rifles spitting death into the oncoming mass of Japanese soldiers. In the chaos and darkness, illuminated only by muzzle flashes and the occasional flare, the scene was something from a nightmare. Bodies fell, but more kept coming, an endless tide of enemy soldiers flowing toward the defensive positions like a dark flood. Then came the grenades. The Japanese began hurling them into the Gurkha trenches, trying to blast the defenders out of their positions. Lachhi saw the first one arc through the air, a small dark sphere that meant death for anyone near it. Without thinking, operating on pure instinct and training, he caught it and threw it back. It exploded in mid-air, the blast lighting up the battlefield for a split second. Another grenade came. Lachhi caught this one too, his reflexes working faster than conscious thought. He threw it back, and again it detonated harmlessly away from their position. The Japanese grenadiers were good, but Lachhi was better, his timing perfect, his courage absolute. Each grenade that came sailing toward him was a dice roll with death, and he kept winning, kept throwing them back, kept protecting his brothers in arms. Then came the third grenade. Lachhi's hand closed around it, his arm already cocking back to throw, when it exploded. The blast was tremendous, a white-hot eruption that shattered the night. Lachhi felt his hand disintegrate, felt the shrapnel tear into his face and body, felt himself lifted and thrown backward like a rag doll tossed by an angry child. The pain was beyond description, beyond anything he'd ever imagined. His right hand was simply gone, blown off at the wrist. His face was shredded, blood pouring from wounds across his head and body. His right eye was destroyed, his vision severely impaired. He should have died right there. By all logic, all medical science, all reasonable expectations, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung should have bled out in that trench within minutes. His brothers in arms lay dead or dying around him. The Japanese were still coming, their assault intensifying, sensing weakness in the defensive line. And there was Lachhi, one-handed, vision severely impaired, bleeding from a dozen wounds, his life pouring out onto the Burmese soil. But Gurkhas don't quit. That's not just propaganda or romantic mythology. It's a truth so fundamental to their identity that it transcends normal human limitations. Lachhi's body was destroyed, but his spirit was intact, and for a Gurkha, that's all that matters. Through the blood and pain and darkness, he made a decision. If he was going to die, it would be on his feet, fighting, taking as many of the enemy with him as possible. He pulled himself up, using his left hand and sheer willpower. His rifle was still there, and his left hand still worked. He propped the weapon against the side of the trench, firing single shots when targets presented themselves. When Japanese soldiers came close enough, he had his kukri at his belt. The pain was extraordinary, but pain was just sensation, and sensation could be ignored if the cause was just enough. What happened next has been documented in British military records, and verified through official Victoria Cross citations. Rifleman Gurung, despite catastrophic wounds that would have incapacitated most men, held his position through repeated Japanese assaults over several hours. The official citation states that at least 31 enemy casualties were later found in front of his position. Whether all were killed by Lachhi alone or in combination with his fallen comrades before they died cannot be definitively stated, but what is certain is that this small section of trench held when it should have been overrun in minutes. The Japanese couldn't understand what they were facing. In their military tradition, wounded soldiers were finished, broken, no longer combat effective. The idea that a man could take those kinds of wounds and continue fighting was beyond their comprehension. The defensive position that should have been easily taken had become a killing ground, and the attack faltered, then broke. Lachhi's world had narrowed to shapes and shadows, sounds and movement. With one eye destroyed and vision severely impaired, he fought by instinct and feel, his left hand moving between rifle and kukri as the situation demanded. When the rifle ran out of ammunition, he used it as a club. When Japanese soldiers came within arm's reach, the kukri found them. His body was running on adrenaline and something beyond adrenaline, a will to survive and fight that came from someplace deeper than normal human psychology could explain. He talked to himself during those hours, or perhaps he was praying. Gurkhas are typically Hindu, and Lachhi called on his gods for strength, for courage, for the ability to keep fighting just one more minute, just one more second. He thought about his mother, waiting for him in their mountain village. He thought about his brothers in arms, dead around him, and knew he couldn't dishonor their sacrifice by giving up. He thought about the motto, "Better to die than be a coward," and he kept fighting. The Japanese finally withdrew as dawn approached, their assault broken against the Gurkha defensive line. Other positions had held as well, but it was Lachhi's stand that became the stuff of immediate legend, the story spreading through the unit before the sun was fully up. When help finally arrived, the medics couldn't believe what they found. Lachhi was still conscious, still gripping his bloody weapons, still ready to fight. The ground around his position was carpeted with spent shell casings and dead Japanese soldiers. His body was a catastrophic mess of wounds, injuries that should have killed him 3 times over. The medics who treated him were hardened veterans who'd seen every kind of war wound imaginable, and they stood in awe of what this small man had endured and survived. The evacuation was a nightmare. The nearest field hospital was hours away over rough terrain, and Lachhi drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey. His vital signs were so weak that twice the medics thought they'd lost him, thought they were transporting a corpse. But each time, impossibly, he rallied. His body refused to die, that Gurkha spirit burning like a flame that wouldn't be extinguished. The surgeons at the field hospital performed emergency surgery, doing what they could to stabilize him. His right hand was gone, his right eye destroyed beyond any hope of recovery. He had shrapnel wounds covering his body, massive blood loss, and internal injuries that would cause him pain for the rest of his life. The doctors gave him a slim chance of surviving the night, let alone recovering enough to ever leave the hospital. But they didn't know Gurkhas. Lachhi survived that night, and the next one, and the one after that. Slowly, incredibly, he began to recover. The human body's ability to heal is remarkable, but what Lachhi did went beyond normal physiology. He willed himself to live, fought death as hard as he'd fought the Japanese, and won. Within weeks, he was sitting up. Within months, he was walking. The doctors called it a miracle. Lachhi called it duty. He wasn't finished serving yet. The British military had seen plenty of heroism during World War II. They'd given out thousands of medals, recognized countless acts of courage. But what Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung had done was in a category by itself. When the full details of his stand became clear, when the evidence was compiled and witness statements taken, There was no question about what decoration he deserved. On December 19, 1945, King George VI presented him with the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for valour in combat. The citation read that Rifleman Gurung had shown outstanding gallantry and extreme devotion to duty in the face of the enemy. The ceremony was emotional. Lachhi stood at attention, all 4 feet 11 inches of him, his empty right sleeve pinned to his uniform, his ruined eye hidden behind a patch. The king reportedly looked at him for a long moment before pinning on the medal, recognizing in this young Gurkha something fundamental about courage, about duty, about the human spirit's capacity to endure the unendurable. Other soldiers in attendance, men who'd fought across Europe and Asia, who'd seen Normandy and Monte Cassino and a dozen other hells, openly wept. Because they understood what Lachhi had done, understood the cost, understood that they were in the presence of something rare and sacred. But the story doesn't end with a medal and a parade. Lachhi's war wounds plagued him for the rest of his life. The pain never fully left him. He struggled with the loss of his hand, learning to do with one hand what most men do with two. His ruined eye caused constant problems. The psychological scars, though less visible, were perhaps even deeper. He had nightmares for years, reliving that night over and over, seeing the faces of the men he'd killed, hearing the sounds of battle, feeling the grenade explode in his hand. After the war, Lachhi returned to Nepal, to his mountain village. He married, raised a family, tried to build a normal life. But normal was impossible for someone who'd experienced what he'd experienced. He was celebrated as a hero, certainly. The Victoria Cross made him one of the most decorated soldiers in Gurkha history. But he carried the weight of that night with him always, a burden that no medal could lighten. The British government provided him a pension for his wounds, but it wasn't generous by modern standards. Lachhi lived modestly, working when he could, struggling with poverty despite his status as a war hero. It's a sadly common story, the warrior celebrated during the war, then quietly forgotten once peace arrives. But Lachhi never complained. That wasn't the Gurkha way. He'd done his duty, honored his oath, served with courage. The rest was just life, to be endured as he'd endured everything else. In his later years, Lachhi became something of an ambassador for the Gurkha community, travelling occasionally to Britain for remembrance ceremonies and reunions. When he walked into a room full of veterans, conversation would stop. Everyone knew who he was, knew what he'd done. Young soldiers would approach him, wanting to shake his remaining hand, wanting some of that courage to rub off on them. And Lachhi, ever humble, would smile and tell them that any Gurkha would have done the same, that there was nothing special about him. But there was something special about him, something that transcends normal courage. What Lachhi did that night in Burma wasn't just about physical bravery or combat skills. It was about an absolute refusal to accept defeat, to surrender to circumstance, to let his brothers in arms die unavenged. It was about a promise made, better to die than be a coward, and a promise kept no matter the cost. In an age of moral relativism and situational ethics, there's something almost shocking about such absolute commitment to a code of honor. Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung died in 2010, at the age of 92. His passing was noted in Britain and Nepal. His story retold once more for a generation that knew World War II only from history books and movies. The Victoria Cross that he'd earned that bloody night in 1945 was donated to the Gurkha Museum, where it remains on display today, a small piece of metal that represents everything good and noble about military service. But the real memorial to Lachhi isn't in any museum. It's in the Gurkha regiment itself, where his story is still told to new recruits, where his example still inspires young men from the mountains of Nepal to serve with honor and courage. It's in the motto that every Gurkha lives by, better to die than be a coward. It's in the knowledge that when everything is stripped away, when you're wounded and bleeding, when your brothers are dead, when the enemy is overwhelming your position, when any rational person would surrender or flee. Character is all you have left. And character is everything. The modern world has trouble with stories like Lachhi's. We want our heroes to be complicated, flawed, morally ambiguous. We're suspicious of clear-cut valor, of black and white distinctions between courage and cowardice. We've seen enough wars go wrong to be cynical about military service, enough propaganda to question all official narratives. And there's wisdom in that skepticism, certainly. War is complicated, and heroism alone doesn't make a war just. But none of that changes what Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung did on that night in May 1945. None of it diminishes his courage or his sacrifice. Sometimes a story is just what it appears to be. One man, facing impossible odds, refusing to quit because quitting wasn't in his nature. No hidden agenda, no political complexity, no moral ambiguity. Just a young soldier, far from home, doing what he'd sworn to do, paying a price that few of us can imagine. Today, when we talk about warrior culture or military values or the meaning of duty, we're often speaking abstractly, dealing in concepts rather than concrete realities. But Lachhi's story reminds us that these aren't just words. They're lived experiences, choices made in moments of extreme pressure, prices paid in blood and pain and lifelong suffering. When a Gurkha says better to die than be a coward, he means it literally. Lachhi proved it. There's a final detail to this story that's worth sharing. Years after the war, a journalist asked Lachhi if he'd been afraid that night, facing those overwhelming odds with his terrible wounds. Lachhi thought about it for a moment, then gave an answer that was pure Gurkha. Afraid? No. I was angry. They killed my brothers. They thought I was finished. I wanted to show them they were wrong. And show them he did. Despite catastrophic wounds that would have killed most men, he held his position against repeated enemy assaults. Not because he was superhuman, but because he was fully human, because he'd made a choice about who he wanted to be and refused to compromise on it even when compromise meant survival. That's the real lesson of Lachhiman Gurung's story. Not that we should all seek out combat or that war is glorious, but that we all face moments, maybe not as dramatic, maybe not as deadly, but real nonetheless, when we have to choose between the easy path and the right path, between giving up and pressing on, between who we want to be and who we actually are. Lachhi chose. He always chose courage, chose honor, chose duty. And for several hours on a dark night in Burma, one small man became something immortal, something that will be remembered as long as people value bravery and sacrifice. They thought the Gurkha was dead. They were wrong. In a very real sense, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung will never die. His story lives on, an eternal reminder of what humans are capable of when pushed to the absolute limit and beyond. Better to die than be a coward. Lachhi lived those words, fought for them, bled for them. And in doing so, he gave us all something precious, proof that heroism isn't mythology, that honor isn't just a word, that courage can overcome anything, even death itself.